The candles flickered against stone walls as whispers echoed through Hampton Court's shadowed corridors. Behind tapestries depicting saints and angels, a different kind of devotion was taking place. The year was 1536, and England's most powerful family was about to tear itself apart, not through war or politics, but through desires so twisted they would reshape a kingdom forever. In the royal chambers, where silk sheets bore the Tudor rose, secrets festered like wounds that refused to heal. What the court chroniclers never recorded, what the official histories carefully omitted, were the appetites that drove England's ruling dynasty to madness. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtains on the Tudor family's most disturbing intimate secrets, the forbidden relationships, the perverse obsessions, and the sexual scandals that nearly destroyed the English throne. From Henry VIII's grotesque private rituals to the shocking truth about Elizabeth I's hidden chambers, these aren't the sanitized stories you learned in school. These are the whispered confessions of servants, the coded letters between lovers, and the medical records that reveal just how far England's royal family fell into depravity. Before we descend into this labyrinth of lust and lies, hit subscribe to Scandalous Pasts so you never miss our explorations into history's most forbidden corners. Now, steel yourself. The Tudor secrets we're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about England's golden age. Chapter 1. The King's monstrous appetites. Henry VIII's reputation as a serial wife-killer barely scratches the surface of his true nature. Behind the public executions and political marriages lay a man whose sexual appetites grew more disturbing with each passing year. Court physicians' private notes, discovered centuries later in hidden compartments, paint a picture of a monarch whose bedroom became a theater of increasingly bizarre rituals. The transformation began after his jousting accident in 1536. The head injury that left him unconscious for hours didn't just change his personality, it unleashed something monstrous. Ladies-in-waiting reported strange sounds emanating from the royal chambers at all hours. Not the typical sounds of passion, but something far more unsettling. Rhythmic chanting, the crack of leather, and occasionally, screams that servants were forbidden to acknowledge. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, confided to her Spanish confessor about Henry's unnatural demands that left her bruised and terrified. The confessor's letters, smuggled out of England and hidden in Vatican archives, describe practices so shocking that even the Spanish Inquisition considered them unholy. Henry's obsession with control extended far beyond the political realm. He demanded complete submission in the most intimate moments, often incorporating religious artifacts in ways that bordered on sacrilege. But it was within Boleyn that Henry's appetites truly descended into darkness. Court records show unusual purchases during their courtship, restraints crafted by the royal blacksmith, mirrors positioned strategically around the bedchamber, and most disturbing of all, a collection of masks depicting various saints and devils. Anne's own letters to her sister Mary reveal her growing horror at what Henry expected from their private encounters. He speaks of love, she wrote, but his eyes hold something else entirely. Something that makes my skin crawl even as I smile and curtsy. The letter, discovered in 1987 during renovations at Hever Castle, goes on to describe Henry's fascination with watching her fear, how he would orchestrate elaborate scenarios designed to terrify her before demanding her compliance. The king's physicians noted his increasing reliance on aphrodisiacs and stimulants, many imported at enormous expense from the Far East. Dr. William Butts, Henry's personal physician, kept detailed records of the king's consumption of ground rhinoceros horn, exotic herbs, and stranger substances that modern analysis suggests included hallucinogenic compounds. These drugs, combined with his head injury, may explain the increasingly erratic and violent nature of his intimate relationships. Jane Seymour, his third wife, lasted longer than most precisely because she learned to accommodate Henry's darkest fantasies. Servant testimonies describe how she would spend hours preparing for the king's visits, donning costumes that ranged from nuns' habits to elaborate headdresses that obscured her face entirely. Henry's fascination with anonymity and intimacy grew so pronounced that he reportedly couldn't perform unless his partner was somehow disguised or transformed. The most disturbing accounts come from the final years of his life, when Henry's obesity and declining health made normal relations impossible. Palace records show payments to a series of special attendants, young women whose job descriptions were deliberately vague but whose quarters were located directly adjacent to the king's chambers. These women, some barely 16, were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death, but their medical treatments tell a grim story of abuse and trauma. Tudor. But's final notes on Henry describe a man consumed by rage at his own physical limitations, taking out his frustrations in increasingly creative and cruel ways. The physician wrote of implements designed specifically for the king's use, crafted by artisans who were immediately exiled to ensure their silence. When Henry finally died in 1547, his body was so grotesquely swollen that the coffin had to be specially reinforced, but the real horror was what the embalmers discovered, evidence of self-inflicted wounds and modifications that suggested a mind completely detached from reality. Chapter 2, The Virgin Queen's Hidden Chambers. Elizabeth I carefully cultivated image as the Virgin Queen was perhaps the greatest deception in English history. Behind the white makeup and elaborate ruffs lay a woman whose sexual appetites were as complex and disturbing as her father's, but infinitely more sophisticated in their concealment. The Queen, who claimed to be married only to England, maintained a series of secret chambers beneath Greenwich Palace where her true nature was allowed to flourish. The discovery of these chambers in 1953, during post-war restoration work, sent shockwaves through the historical community. What they found defied everything scholars thought they knew about Elizabeth. The rooms were accessed through a hidden panel behind a portrait of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and contained furnishings that suggested activities far removed from statecraft. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was more than just Elizabeth's favorite courtier, he was the keeper of her darkest secrets. Their correspondence, written in a code that took cryptographers decades to crack, reveals a relationship built on mutual psychological manipulation and increasingly dangerous games of power and submission. Elizabeth's letters describe scenarios where she would role-play as various historical figures, from Cleopatra to Joan of Arc, while Dudley was expected to respond as their legendary lovers or conquerors. But Dudley wasn't her only confidant in these matters. Christopher Marlowe, the playwright and suspected spy, served a dual purpose in Elizabeth's court. While officially tasked with writing entertainment for the royal household, his real job was crafting elaborate scenarios for the Queen's private amusement. His plays, when examined closely, contain coded references to Elizabeth's preferences, scenes of powerful women dominating male subjects, elaborate costume changes, and themes of transformation and disguise. The Queen's fascination with transformation extended to her physical appearance in these private moments. Servant accounts describe a collection of wigs, cosmetics, and clothing that allowed her to become entirely different people. Sometimes she would appear as a commoner, other times as a foreign princess, and occasionally, most disturbing of all, as a man. These transformations weren't mere dress-up, they were elaborate psychological exercises that allowed Elizabeth to explore aspects of power and control impossible in her public role. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, was tasked with procuring partners for the Queen's private entertainments. His network, which officially gathered intelligence on foreign threats, also recruited young men and women from across Europe to serve in Elizabeth's hidden chambers. These individuals were chosen not just for their physical attributes, but for their ability to maintain absolute secrecy and their willingness to participate in increasingly elaborate scenarios. The most shocking discovery in the hidden chambers was a series of detailed journals in Elizabeth's own hand, documenting her experiences and fantasies. These writings reveal a mind obsessed with the intersection of power and pleasure, describing scenarios where she would sentence courtiers to various punishments that blurred the line between political authority and personal gratification. The journals also detail her fascination with watching others, suggesting that many of her court's romantic entanglements were orchestrated for her private viewing. Elizabeth's relationship with the Earl of Essex takes on a sinister new dimension when viewed through this lens. Their public conflicts, which eventually led to his execution, were reportedly extensions of their private games. Essex's increasingly reckless behavior may have been driven by his knowledge of Elizabeth's secrets and his role in satisfying her darker appetites. His final letters, written from the Tower of London, contain veiled references to services rendered and secrets that die with me. The Queen's physicians noted her unusual requests for certain herbs and compounds, many of which modern analysis suggests were used to enhance or alter consciousness during her private encounters. Dr. John Dee, her court astrologer and alchemist, wasn't just predicting the future, he was concocting potions designed to heighten sensation and lower inhibitions. His laboratory notes describe experiments with various plant extracts and mineral compounds, all tested on volunteers before being presented to the Queen. Perhaps most disturbing of all were Elizabeth's final years, when age and illness made her previous activities impossible. Courtiers reported that she became obsessed with watching younger members of her court, orchestrating increasingly complex romantic scenarios among her ladies-in-waiting and male courtiers. She would position herself behind specially designed screens, observing and occasionally directing the action like a theatrical performance designed solely for her entertainment. Chapter 3, The Bloody Mary's Twisted Devotions. Mary Tudor's reign of terror wasn't just about burning Protestants, it was about a woman whose religious fervor had become fatally entangled with sexual obsession. The Queen, who earned the nickname, Bloody Mary, brought to the throne a psyche warped by years of humiliation, rejection, and a desperate need to prove her worthiness in the eyes of both God and man. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was presented as a political alliance, but private correspondence between Mary and her confessor reveals the union's true nature. Mary's letters describe her wedding night in terms that blur the line between religious ecstasy and physical submission. She wrote of surrendering completely to God's will as manifested through my husband's desires, language that suggests Philip's role extended far beyond that of a conventional spouse. The Spanish ambassador's secret reports to his king paint a disturbing picture of Mary's behavior during the early months of her marriage. She would spend hours in prayer before Philip's visits, flagellating herself until blood stained her shift, believing that physical pain would make her more pleasing to both her husband and her God. Philip, reportedly disgusted by these displays, began avoiding the Queen's chambers, which only intensified her self-destructive behaviors. Mary's phantom pregnancies take on a sinister new meaning when examined through the lens of her psychological state. Court physicians' notes describe a woman so desperate for motherhood that she would simulate pregnancy symptoms through various means, including the consumption of herbs that caused her belly to swell and her breasts to produce milk. These false pregnancies weren't just political embarrassments, they were manifestations of a mind that had lost touch with reality. The Queen's relationship with her confessor, Father Alfonso de Castro, crossed boundaries that even the Catholic Church found troubling. Their private sessions, which could last for hours, involved detailed confessions of Mary's most intimate thoughts and desires. Castro's own letters to Rome describe a penitent whose confessions had become increasingly graphic and disturbing, focusing on fantasies that combined religious imagery with explicit sexual content. Mary's persecution of Protestants wasn't just about religious orthodoxy, it was about sexual jealousy and psychological projection. Many of the women she ordered burned were young, attractive, and defiant in ways that Mary herself could never be. The Queen would often attend these executions personally, watching from a specially constructed viewing platform as her victims suffered. Witnesses reported that Mary's behavior during these events was unnaturally intense, her breathing becoming labored and her hands trembling with what appeared to be excitement rather than religious fervor. The most disturbing aspect of Mary's reign was her treatment of young female prisoners. Those brought before her for religious crimes were subjected to examinations that went far beyond theological questioning. Mary would personally inspect these women, ostensibly checking for signs of demonic possession or heretical markings, but the examinations often involved intimate physical contact that served no religious purpose. Palace servants reported strange sounds coming from the Queen's private chapel during her late-night prayer sessions. These weren't the typical sounds of devotion, but something more primal and disturbing. Mary had commissioned a series of religious artifacts that blurred the line between worship and perversion, crucifixes designed for intimate contact, religious paintings that depicted saints in compromising positions, and prayer books illustrated with imagery that would have scandalized even the most liberal theologians. Her relationship with Cardinal Reginald Pole, her chief religious advisor, was marked by an intensity that troubled even the Catholic hierarchy. Their correspondence reveals a relationship that combined spiritual guidance with psychological manipulation. Poles seemed to understand Mary's need for submission and used it to control her political decisions, often framing his advice in terms of divine commands that required her complete obedience. The Queen's final months were marked by increasingly erratic behavior that suggested a complete break from reality. She began seeing visions of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, who would allegedly appear in her chambers and engage her in conversations about suffering, sacrifice, and the need to purify England through pain. These visions often coincided with Mary's most violent persecutions, suggesting that her psychological deterioration was directly linked to her political cruelty. Chapter 4, The Seymour Scandal. The Seymour family's rise to power came at a cost that would haunt the Tudor court for generations. When Jane Seymour became Henry VIII's third wife, she brought with her two brothers whose ambitions were matched only by their willingness to exploit the most vulnerable members of the royal household. The scandal that eventually destroyed them reveals the depths of corruption and abuse that festered beneath the Tudor court's glittering surface. Thomas Seymour, Jane's younger brother, was appointed Lord Admiral after her marriage to the king, but his real interests lay in more personal conquests. His pursuit of the teenage Princess Elizabeth was just the beginning of a pattern of predatory behavior that extended throughout the royal household. Servants' testimonies describe a man who used his position to gain access to young women and girls, often under the guise of offering them advancement or protection. The most shocking aspect of the Seymour scandal was Thomas's relationship with Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. After the king's death, Catherine married Thomas in secret, but their union quickly became a nightmare of manipulation and abuse. Catherine's private letters to her stepdaughter Mary described Thomas's unnatural appetites and his insistence on involving others in their intimate moments. Princess Elizabeth, barely 14 when Thomas began his pursuit, was subjected to what modern law would recognize as systematic grooming and abuse. The romps described in historical accounts, where Thomas would burst into Elizabeth's chambers and engage in physical play, were actually calculated assaults designed to normalize inappropriate contact. Elizabeth's governess, Kat Ashley, tried to protect her charge but was threatened with dismissal if she interfered. The situation escalated when Catherine Parr discovered Thomas in Elizabeth's chambers one morning, the princess partially undressed and clearly distressed. Rather than protecting Elizabeth, Catherine blamed the girl for encouraging Thomas's attention, a response that suggests she was either complicit in the abuse or too terrified of her husband to act. The incident led to Elizabeth's removal from the household, but the damage was already done. Edward Seymour, Thomas's older brother and Lord Protector during young Edward VI's minority, was equally corrupt but more sophisticated in his methods. He used his position to arrange marriages and liaisons that served his political purposes, often involving children barely past puberty. His own household became a breeding ground for abuse, with young wards and servants subjected to the whims of their supposed protectors. The brothers' downfall came when their activities could no longer be concealed. Thomas's attempt to kidnap young King Edward VI was the public face of his treason, but the real motivation was his fear that his other crimes were about to be exposed. Catherine Parr's death shortly after childbirth was officially attributed to childbed fever, but her symptoms and the circumstances surrounding her death suggest she may have been poisoned to ensure her silence. Elizabeth's later behavior as queen takes on new significance when viewed through the lens of her traumatic experiences with Thomas Seymour. Her famous declaration that she would never marry may have been less about political independence and more about psychological trauma. Her relationships with male courtiers were carefully controlled and never allowed to develop into genuine intimacy, suggesting a deep-seated fear of male authority and sexual contact. The Seymour scandal also reveals the complicity of the broader court in covering up abuse. Servants who witnessed inappropriate behavior were silenced through threats or bribes. Court officials who should have protected vulnerable young people instead facilitated their exploitation. The entire system was designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless, creating an environment where predators could operate with impunity. Chapter 5, The Final Corruption. As the Tudor dynasty entered its final phase, the corruption that had always lurked beneath the surface began to consume everything in its path. The court that had once been the envy of Europe became a cesspit of blackmail, manipulation, and sexual exploitation. The very foundations of royal authority were undermined by the personal failings of those who wielded it. The Earl of Leicester's influence over Elizabeth wasn't just romantic, it was based on his knowledge of her darkest secrets and his willingness to facilitate her most disturbing desires. His network of informants and procurers extended throughout the kingdom, identifying potential participants for the Queen's private entertainments and ensuring their silence afterward. Those who refused to cooperate often found themselves facing trumped-up charges or mysterious accidents. Sir Walter Raleigh's rise to prominence came not through his supposed romantic relationship with Elizabeth, but through his willingness to serve as her agent in acquiring exotic substances and practices from the New World. His expeditions brought back more than gold and tobacco, they imported techniques and substances that Elizabeth incorporated into her private rituals. Native American shamanic practices, South American plant medicines, and Caribbean voodoo traditions all found their way into the Queen's hidden chambers. The court's younger generation, raised in this atmosphere of corruption, became increasingly depraved. The Earl of Essex's rebellion wasn't just about political power, it was about a young man driven to madness by the psychological games he'd been forced to play since childhood. His final letters reveal someone who had been systematically abused and manipulated, used as a pawn in Elizabeth's twisted entertainment until he could no longer distinguish between reality and performance. Christopher Marlowe's death in a Deptford tavern wasn't a simple bar fight, it was an assassination ordered by those who feared his knowledge of the court's secrets. As Elizabeth's private playwright and procurer, Marlowe had become too dangerous to live. His plays, when decoded, reveal not just artistic genius but detailed accounts of the Queen's private activities. His murder was made to look random, but the precision of the attack and the immediate disappearance of his papers suggest careful planning. The final years of Elizabeth's reign were marked by increasing paranoia and cruelty. Courtiers who had once competed for her favor now lived in terror of her displeasure. The Queen's mood swings became legendary, but they weren't just the eccentricities of an aging monarch, they were the behavior of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. Her demands became more extreme, her punishments more creative, and her need for control more desperate. The discovery of Elizabeth's private chambers after her death sent shockwaves through the new Jacobean court. James I ordered everything destroyed and the rooms sealed, but not before several courtiers glimpsed the contents. Their whispered accounts describe artifacts and implements that defied explanation, artwork that bordered on blasphemous, and written records that revealed the true extent of the Tudor family's corruption. The transition to the Stuart dynasty wasn't just a change of ruling family, it was an attempt to purge the kingdom of the moral contamination that had infected it for over a century. James I's obsession with witchcraft and moral purity may have been his response to learning the truth about his predecessors. His persecution of Catholics and Puritans alike suggests a man desperate to cleanse England of any remaining traces of Tudor influence. But the damage was already done. The Tudor legacy wasn't just political, it was psychological. The courtiers who survived the transition carried with them the knowledge of what they had witnessed and participated in. Their children and grandchildren inherited not just titles and lands, but secrets that would shape English society for generations to come. The English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the eventual restoration of the monarchy can all be seen as consequences of the moral corruption introduced by the Tudors. A kingdom that had learned to accept the unacceptable, to normalize the abnormal, and to celebrate the corrupt was doomed to tear itself apart. The Tudor family's sexual secrets weren't just personal failings, they were the seeds of national destruction. Epilogue: the echoes of corruption today. As tourists walk through Hampton Court and the Tower of London, they see sanitized versions of Tudor history. The gift shops sell romantic novels about Henry's wives and Elizabeth's courtiers. The guided tours focus on political achievements and artistic patronage. But beneath the polished floors and behind the restored tapestries, the shadows of the Tudor family's true nature still linger. The hidden chambers have been sealed, the incriminating documents destroyed or hidden away in private collections. The official histories continue to perpetuate myths of romantic love and noble sacrifice. But for those who know where to look, the evidence remains. In coded letters tucked away in forgotten archives, in architectural details that reveal hidden purposes, in medical records that tell stories the court historians never wanted preserved. The Tudor family's sexual secrets weren't just personal scandals, they were symptoms of a deeper corruption that infected every aspect of English society. When absolute power is combined with unchecked desire, when religious authority is twisted to serve personal appetites, when the protection of the innocent is sacrificed to the pleasure of the powerful, the result is a moral cancer that spreads until it consumes everything in its path. The Tudors gave England its golden age, but they also gave it a legacy of corruption that would take centuries to overcome. Their palaces still stand, their portraits still hang in galleries, their stories are still told to schoolchildren. But the real truth about England's most famous royal family remains buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda, waiting for those brave enough to dig deeper into history's darkest corners. So what do you think? Which of these Tudor secrets shocked you the most? Henry's grotesque private rituals, Elizabeth's hidden chambers, or the systematic abuse that corrupted an entire court? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for scandalous pasts so you never miss our deep dives into history's most forbidden stories. Until next time, remember that the stories we tell about the past are often more fiction than fact. The real truth is always darker, more complex, and more disturbing than the sanitized versions we're taught to accept. Keep questioning, keep digging, and keep seeking the scandalous truths that shaped our world. Please note that all stories shared on Scandalous Pasts are fictional narratives that may or may not be inspired by real historical events. While we strive for historical authenticity in our storytelling, these tales are created for entertainment purposes and should not be considered factual historical accounts.